I am Emily Clark. I am the Director of Architectural Services here at ATG.
And I am Don Rasmussen, the Director of MEP Services here at ATG. And I'll kick it to Bruce, we'll go to Sam, and then Mark. How's that sound?
Sounds good. I'm Bruce Gunderson. I'm the Technology Director at Hartman Majewski Design Group in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been in the industry for about over 20 years now, going from CAD, architectural desktop, if anyone actually use those, going into Revit back in 2003 or so, before it was purchased by Autodesk, and have been part of a 505 BIM users group here in Albuquerque for the past almost 11, 12 years now, and locally getting all our industry consultants and owners to work together in some sort of BIM capacity. I've also worked with a contractor for the past 4 years or so. So I also have experience in working the BIM on the contractor side, coordinating, working with subcontractors out in the field. So I have a lot of experience in the BIM, working on the contractor and architectural side, and now able to work with a few owners in BIM as well, and how do we push that on the operating side. So it's great stuff. I'm glad to see it moving along for the past 15 years or so.
Yeah, and it's really good to see that you do bring some experience from the owner side, because that's one aspect that we don't necessarily have represented here. So thanks, Bruce.
Okay, and I'm Sam Tijan. I work for Miron Construction. We're a large construction company based out of Neenah, Wisconsin. We've got offices kind of all over the Midwest. Iowa and Illinois stick out to me, but so I actually have been working in the design and engineering side of the field for about 25 years, and very recently, in fact this summer, took on a job over here at Miron Construction in their virtual construction department. So I've been working in the BIM forum for a while. It's been kind of pushing the design side of things for a long time, so it's really interesting now to get back on the construction side and see things from a little bit different lens, and kind of made some things a little more clear to me and some things maybe a little less clear. So it'll be interesting to hear what people have to say.
And I'm Mark Mergenschroer. So I actually work for Autodesk, but for 23 of my 25 years, I was in the MEP design and engineering and subcontracting side of things here in Little Rock, Arkansas. So now I work with facilities, work with owners, work on, with BIM 360 Ops and helping implement that. My previous experience with MEP, I was actually part of the LOD spec committee at one time for the BIM forum. So hopefully I can add some value today.
Absolutely, lots of knowledge here and experience. So go ahead and start typing in those questions, and we'll get some of those answered. So I'm going to start with the first question here. What is the value of LOD to owners and facilities teams?
Well, I'll take that.
Yeah.
Bruce, you can follow up. How's that? So with the LOD and how it's specified, in coming the elements as they come through the process, as they come through the models, and then taking them to owners and facilities, what value is that? And it all depends on what that owner and facility team truly needs. The LOD is amazing for construction, getting it through the process, but then what do we actually hand over, and how do we hand it over? And that's where the value can bring, if we truly bring in that facilities team into the discussion. In my job now with BIM 360 Ops, that discussion seems to be missing. So we're not necessarily getting that value for facilities. We're handing a bunch of data over to the owner, but necessarily that value isn't flowing down to the maintenance and maintenance side of facilities. So that's where I can see the value of LOD really increasing, is bringing that discussion into the BIM execution plans, into the BIM development plans, and having that team so that there's not a bunch of wasted effort. Bruce, what do you think about that?
And I think it's our job as the designers, constructors to educate our clients and our owners, building owners. It's one of the lowest budget items on their operations is the facility and maintenance. So how do we help them see that value that you spoke of? How do we give them that information so that they can engage the design teams, not at such a high level? Yes, they want a building or they want to add on to a building, but what does that really mean to the facility people and how it's going to be operated for the next 25 years?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really on our shoulders to provide that education to our owners, and they're asking for it. Why we have this conversation right now. I think it's picking up. For the past 25 years, we've been doing BIM on the design side, and the construction side is finally getting into it hot and heavy. It's time for the owners to kind of step up and be part of the solution in how we move forward with the technology and the data.
Yeah, I guess
So-
I just piggyback on that a little bit with the fact that even before you get to the operations of the actual facility, we're certainly seeing on both the design and the construction side that talking about that LOD up front and utilizing what that can mean from a communication standpoint. In other words, how far are we going to develop this model? And if we're going to do that, can we use that to facilitate better communication of how things are going to be laid out, how things are going to be designed, and how things are going to work once they're there? In the past, we've kind of left that all to the end, and we've gotten sort of spreadsheet feedback from owners and facility operators, and that doesn't always translate to a really well-functioning layout. Taking these types of things, and if we say we're going to, take that LOD on certain elements of the building to a much higher degree, and then bring those owners in and use things like virtual reality and augmented reality to be able to communicate what's going on in their building and what the designers are talking about from a constructability standpoint, how this is going to be put together, from a millwright standpoint, how this equipment is going to be installed. So I think taking that LOD and actually providing some meaning back to these owners and facility operators, I'm seeing a lot more of that now. And I'm seeing that push come from the owner side of it. So us on the design and construction side of things need to start facilitating that better and having these discussions about what that means to the whole team.
And I just wanted to follow up on something that Mark had mentioned, that it's not really rolling down to the, the facilities team that is, would benefit from that. Why do you think that is? Well, where is the missing gap that it's, we're taking it to a certain point, but we're just not, getting to the finish line?
So for me, we have this amazing LOD spec. It's over 250 pages now. It's got lots of great data, and it's lots of great data for design and construction. But then when we look at facilities, are they talking BIM language or do they talk facilities language? And how is all of that data structured? Is it structured for construction, design and construction, or is it truly structured for a facility use? And, a couple of years ago, I was at ASHI and I asked the owners, there was over 400 healthcare facility people in that room. I asked them, when do you get your data? And the common answer was between 12 and 18 months. So if we're structuring this data, if we can get this data structured, we can hand over that data earlier and in a better way to help them maintain it. And that's where I see some of this LOD really providing some extra or added value, or even you as a construction company or design engineering, that could be another revenue source for your firm.
Yeah, and I think the other big problem with that is that the construction and design side have a lot of standards telling us and guiding us how we should be able to work together, communicate together. The facility side doesn't have a lot of standards on between all of them
That's right.
to help them facilitate and understand how to get that data. Each one is unique from what I've seen. They all ask for very unique information. And as a design and construction team, we're not used to even asking for that. How do you want your data?
Yep.
And half the time, whenever I do ask an owner, they just want, please just give me some good CAD files that I can work off of for the, for the next 25 years. And they don't want anything more because it's just so much information. They have no idea how to use that information.
And the ones that I've been involved with that have been successful, we're having that operations conversation at the beginning of the project.
Yes.
We
Yes.
know what the end deliverable is going to be. So many times we don't have that conversation until handover happens, then say, well, what about operation? Well, guys, time to have that conversation was a year ago. So whenever I hear operation, one of the first questions I have is, okay, what do you have in place right now as the building owner for automation? Where are you currently at? Because if you have nothing, I know that I have a long way to go. I have to educate you quite a bit. And if you have something, now I know what kind of shoehorn I need to use, for lack of a better term, to get my data into your system.
Yeah, I get excited whenever they seem to know at least something. Then
absolutely.
we have a direction and a roadmap.
Perfect. There are a couple good follow-up there and answered a couple of the questions that were in the chat. How do you inspect models and validate LOD requirements from each discipline at deliverable milestones? And is that something that you are actively doing?
That one's hard. That one's a hard one to do. I've had to do that for government projects with, GSAs, the Corps of Engineers. They have some very detailed BIM, the VA as well, and they use COBE is the standard that they go to, and COBE is still a very huge tool process to get your head and wrapped around, especially when you're working with so many different entities that are creating that data, and making sure that it's something that the owner can use and push into their piece of software or whatever they're going to be pushing it into. So that's typically the standard right now. I'm sure Mark, you might have something, maybe Sam, you ran into something as well.
So I have a really manual process. It needs to be better. It really does. Because, as most of y'all know, a lot of it is data that is repeatable data, but one string of bad data can really cause a lot of heartache. And so, that's easily missed. So we've got to find better procedures to validate the model. There are the validation tools, that come with the COBE toolkit, that type of stuff. They work, if you know how to use them and know how to use them correctly. But that is something I feel like we as an entire industry has got to get better at.
I think we're up against it a little bit, though, in just the terms of our design and engineering industries are still working under the auspices of, we have schematic design development, and then CDs. There is no really nice, clean correlation between LOD and those different phases. So before we even go in and analyze what those LODs are at different milestones in a project, we have to get away as an industry from trying to associate our traditional, phases or stages of the project with a specific LOD, because it just doesn't work. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing, and certainly on larger projects, is sitting down at the beginning of a meeting and taking that BIM execution plan and going through that responsibility matrix and talking about specific elements, and how far they're going to be developed at each stage. That seems to be more successful. If you just say, at this such and such a date, you know, when the design and engineering documents come in, we want everything to be at LOD 200. Well, that just doesn't cut it, and it really confuses people more than I think it helps things. We have to, as a group on a project or as a group in the industry, have to work on figuring out how we can correlate that development. And I think more importantly, what are the end goals? You know, what are we trying to achieve at each of these milestones? And again, unfortunately, it's going to require a paradigm shift in how we think about these different stages of the project, because again, you just can't keep going back to the same schematic design, development, construction documents and make sense of any of this LOD stuff. It just won't work.
Yeah, it's not applicable, right?
Right.
Thinking a little bit about making comparisons, and Mark, you brought up a really good point about, you know, it's a manual process at this point. It needs to be better. We need to automate that. Shameless plug time. The Express tools, there's a model compare tool that works on element IDs, guys. And so you can run that model compare tool and, you know, element ID based, if they're swapping that element out for a more developed element, that would show up in the reports as something that has changed. So it's something that you can at least use to start it, maybe guide you in the right direction. But yeah, it's not going to be the end all be all. It's still going to be a manual process. You know, Mark, you're unfortunately correct in that.
Wow, did he say I was correct?
I did.
I heard that.
Wow. Wow.
It's going to be a good day.
I'll throw you a bone every once in a while, Mark. You know, you're right.
And I'll tell you, it's so much fun reading those GUIDs. You know, those are
Yeah,
awesome.
GUID numbers are just not boring at all.
They make so much sense.
Yeah. One letter change. Oh.
So how can we as an industry make this better? I mean, Sam, you kind of alluded to, we need to have a better solution for this. You know, how can we make this better?
So one of the challenges I faced on the design side was trying to correlate contract language with LOD. And it's a really challenging topic to get engineers and architects to understand that you can't just say, I'm doing LOD 300 and call it a day, because it's just, it's not achieving anything by doing that. I mean, sure, it covers you, and at the end of the day, you can say, I got my model to LOD 300 overall and we're done. But we need to, again, go back to the beginning of that project and figure out, what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish, you know? And that's different for every project type. Industrial projects where you have a lot of heavy equipment in that LOD is going to be drastically different than an office building. It just is by the nature of it. So I think what I'm driving at there is that as a project team at the very beginning of these projects, you need to really understand what those goals are going to be, so that when we apply these LOD responsibility matrix to things, they make sense and they're all trying to help achieve that goal. If you just go out there as an industry and just pick a number and that's what we're going to stay with because that's where we feel safe, it doesn't do anything for you, for the owner, or for the project team as a whole. So it's moving back to, we got to try and push these conversations, and somebody alluded to it earlier, it has to be almost before these contracts get put together. When you start putting proposals together for projects, you need to start talking about that, you know, and that's challenging for our industry. That's just not the way we've operated in the past. So we as individuals need to kind of sell that to everybody. And that doesn't matter if it's on the construction side or the design side. I see it in both worlds. You start talking about BIM and LOD after the contracts are already together. You know, when you got subs calling up and panicking, but what am I supposed to do for this? Well, nobody's talked about it, right? So that they don't understand what the requirements are for them. The owner certainly doesn't understand what they're getting out of it then. And that's all communication. It's just, so we have to push the envelope to try and get these discussions and these conversations going at the very, very beginning or genesis of these projects, rather than waiting till contracts are already out the door and then trying to fit it to make it work.
And that comes back to the education that we have, you know, as an owner of a building who's saying, hey, I think I need a new building. I've got this pile of money here. I'm asking these people who are the experts to educate me on the best way and process to get me my building? And what are the cost implications? That's a big piece of the puzzle. Even on the design side where we've implemented BIM almost the last 20 years, I'm still getting questions from my consultants. Whoa, that wasn't part of my scope of cost for this design. Subcontractors, we were constantly asked, that wasn't in my scope. What is that gonna, where do I get that money? Where am I getting that stuff from? Training, all sorts of software costs. It's a big deal. And like I said, it's our jobs to help the owners and navigate that and understand that value that this data is bringing to their building the next 25 years, 50 years, whatever it is.
That was actually brought up in a couple different questions. So if anyone wants to elaborate on that is, how do you justify the extra expense of, taking BIM to a higher LOD beyond the construction model? And when you're kind of a two-part question, the expense of training, maintenance software on the facility side, that's an extra expense. So, how are we addressing that, or how are we convincing the owners that this is the right way to go until they finally make that, mind shift to realize that it's beneficial long term? But not everyone really thinks that, we're in this industry where it's just get it done, move to the next. So, how are we addressing that cost, and what are we seeing happen there?
I'm working with an owner now that their value, that they're looking at it from their point of view, is a value of safety for their facility staff. So working with a model, the documents, having the latest and greatest information on hand for their staff to be able to make decisions while they're in front of a piece of equipment is the value that this is bringing to them as an operation. So maybe you look at it from a different point of view from the owners, try to help them look at it from a different point of view, safety, understanding the users of that building in an office building, being able to have the lights on and off. No, not so much from a cost, but maybe from the users being able to use the building more efficiently, seeing how the building is being used. Different points of view, I guess, and how that owner sees the value in it.
Well, so in the first year of operation, if you're not maintaining your equipment properly, what's the operational efficiency that you're losing on that piece of equipment? I mean, that's because that first year, you're going to get the maximum efficiency out of it. So you need to maintain that correctly. And then another thing to help with cost is how much or how long does it take a facilities team to input data into a building management system? Or how long does it take them to set up their preventive maintenance program? Where if we structured the contracts and the LOD to get that data to them earlier, then they're going to be saving steps. They're actually going to be able to maintain the building rather than go search for all this data or filter through all of this handover data that is sometimes unusable for them. One of the projects I worked on, they estimated that it saved over 2,100 man hours in the first year of operation because they had all the documentation before they ever went live with the building. And so that is the type of what you sell is, if we give you this process and you pay this little extra much, what is the value of your technicians maintaining the building versus having to search for documentation? And that's a tremendous value.
Well, and Mark, to your point, I think there's a couple of things happening. That one, the software has gotten better and it's provided easier access for anybody to get at this data, right? Mm-hmm. 10 years ago, if we were going to talk about doing some sort of facilities operational type plan with this data, you were literally requiring that client to get a license of AutoCAD or Revit mm-hmm. and understand how to operate in that software well. Well, that was an impossible sell. It really truly was. I mean, to tell an owner that they have to hire somebody to really come in that facility just to understand that software, to be able to provide that value and data back to the company, that doesn't work. Well, now with having everything web access and be able to see all these metrics right away with all this data from, you know, the start of the project on, I think that it's going to start changing how these requests come to us. Instead of us on the design and construction side of things having to push this to owners, and I'm already seeing it on some of these larger projects, owners are pushing back and they're saying, I want this data. I have to see this data. So I think some of that is going to, you know, it's still, you're always going to have those challenges from a design side. How do I justify this extra cost, right?
Right.
Well, I think now having that data out there, and there's so many ROI type cases, you know, and Autodesk is certainly a good resource for a lot of that stuff. If that's kind of what the conversation is with your client, I think that's where you go with that. You know, here's the types of things that data is going to be able to provide, and here's the benefits that that's going to give to you. Those are tangible things now. It's a much easier discussion, I think, to have now than it was even 5 years ago.
Totally correct.
Absolutely. So when structuring LOD into the contract, do you feel that LOD on the owner side affects just basic services if you're taking it to that level? And how might you structure your fees to be more in line with LOD requirements? Are there any changes to your fee structure, or have you seen that?
From a design portion of it, I don't really see it changing on the fee side. We put that information in, and from a model standpoint and the data in there, we take it to the level of the contract documents, which is the original, you know, that's the contract deliverables. Rarely do we have to move forward in some respects with the owner to move forward with that data even further, unless it's the client is actually specifically asking for it, like GSA projects or VA projects. And even then, because we're a service-based industry, that is probably, it is taken into account, and we do put those fees in there, but at least it's understood from the owner that those fees are there. If the owner's sophisticated enough and in their RFPs, they'll state that and understand that if those fees get brought in, they understand why we're asking for them. But I have been on projects where it wasn't understood. Most of them, we do have a BIM execution plan to help with our consultants working together, collaborating. But there is no requirements to go beyond that. And so whatever we put into that model is on us, and the liability is on us to have that information in there. And we usually have some sort of indemnification form whenever we pass the model on to whoever's going to use it done, the contractor or
That's a big challenge that the design side faces. Bruce, you hit that right on the head. You know, we see all these cases about how the software is going to work and how this process is going to work on a true IPD type project, you know, where everybody's kind of got that shared risk. But that's from my experience on the design side, those contracts, if they existed, were very few and far between. So to try and put that type of structure around your typical contract from a design side, you're right, it doesn't leave you with a lot of options as far as how far you take things, because that word you mentioned, liability, that creeps into everything that, you know, the designers and engineers are looking at. How far am I going to take this thing, and how far can I contractually take this and still have my risk covered? You know, at what point does me modeling things more start conveying means and methods, right? And not just my design intent. So that's another thing I guess we have to kind of wrestle with as an industry, is that the underlying risk and liability on what we put in those models, it's really scaring a lot of, especially smaller design firms, from taking things to that next level. And certainly on smaller projects. You know, large projects, I think you have an easier time, especially industrial projects, of having everybody buy into this. But unless you're doing those on a regular basis, that's not your typical setup for a project. So I don't know that I have a good answer for how you make those designers and engineers necessarily feel better about taking those LODs to a higher extent, because as they do that, you know, to your point, Bruce, that they're bringing on potentially more risk, more liability, even though we try and put language in there, you know, that the model can only be used for X, Y, Z, it's still a model, it's still there, and there's still content in it. So that's something I think we have to start talking about and having more candid conversations about. How do we protect those individuals then? You know, if you're not going to be paid a ton more for that shared risk, then how do you protect that designer or that engineer and still have them, you know, collaborate with the rest of the team?
Especially with our crazy contracts that we have CMAR, you know, design build, it's blurring those lines of our contracts and how we work with each other. You know, from I feel on Sam, you know, as a contractor, we were constantly having to do more work to make sure that the model was correct before we actually did any work out in the field. And that was a lot of work. And who's paying for that? Is that something that as a contractor you see value in, just to make sure that your field teams and your subs are working and collaborating together? So yeah, it's not just on the design side, it falls to the contractor now even more, especially whenever you get weird, odd requests buried in the spec saying, have a clash-free model. What does that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, both of you brought that up. Is I almost got in trouble with that by agreeing to have elements at a certain LOD in a model, and it wasn't covered by our insurance liability. It exceeded what we carried as part of our package for our engineering firm. So that's something you've got to know and got to understand before you do agree something as a BIM manager, because that can get you in a lot of trouble if you put out design documentation that your liability insurance doesn't cover. So due to a scheduling conflict, I'm going to have to drop. I apologize. Great conversations though. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. And if
Always,
there's some
Mark.
questions that come up, feel free to shoot them my way. I really appreciate it. Great job. Appreciate APG
Right.
USA.
Yeah,
Mark.
Good to see you.
That was actually one of the questions that was brought up early on in the chat is, you know, that legal responsibility and how are we addressing that? And, you know, Mark alluded that he had some issues with that and when he was at the firm he was at, but Sam, Bruce, Don, did you guys run into any issues, legal issues that you can speak of, and maybe just any advice? I think a lot of people are looking for guidance on that.
I think having it in the contract, and I say this so much, I think my 505 BIM users are tired of me hearing it from me, but putting in the AIA documents, the E203, and putting in those protocols up front, just put them in there. They're built, their AIA's got them, they're legal documents. Really, if you are a firm who is doing BIM, whether it's just for construction documents or not, those documents should be part of the overall agreement, from the owner to the architect, as well as the owner to the contractor. Before I left the contractor that I was working with previously, I was working with them to get the AIA documents to reflect in their subcontractor. And then I think it's the 401. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. With the subcontractor to have that in there, and also to be part of their RFPs whenever they ask the sub to be part, bring in a bid. Let them know that this is a BIM project. There's going to be fees and costs associated with that. So it's like what Sam said. It's communication with your teams. This is the way we're working now, and we can't keep putting our head in a hole and ignoring it. It's something that we need to be fully aware of.
Bruce, that's
Well,
a
I
great
think you hit on
point. Those
something.
contracts
Oh,
from
go ahead, Sam.
AIA are fantastic. So there's the E202, there's the G201 and the G202, I think. Not only, you know, include those documents in there, but fill them out. There's a really good responsibility matrix, you know, who the model author is going to be. Well, and I say that kind of jokingly, but kind of not. I mean, I've had engineers throw that contract language in there and then never go through the process. So just having the contracts there doesn't necessarily protect that team if you didn't do the work to go through it and figure out who's doing what at what stage. And you can make that really simplistic. You can use just the chart that's in those AIA docs and just go through that. I mean, it could literally be a half-hour meeting and just establish that at the front end of the project and be done with it. And know that you've at least had that discussion and there's a better understanding of all the team members of what it is you guys are going to be responsible for producing in terms of your model.
And those protocols are designed to be living documents. That's what's the beauty of the AIA E203 is those protocols are living documents. So it's designed for the team to always be engaged and always updated as things happen and things change.
Absolutely. Let me go back to the questions here. Don, did you have a follow-up on that as well?
I just wanted to kind of, you know, stress a point that Bruce brought up, which was a great point, because I deal with this all the time in a consultant role here at ATG. It's really imperative that everybody understands LOD at the firm, not just the designers, not just the project managers, right? When someone says LOD 200, you should have a general idea what they're talking about and what that means for a lot of different reasons. It seems that when I go around and I meet with clients and the LOD conversation comes up, you know, people are so calling it level of definition, or, you know, make up your favorite acronym. They don't even know it's level of development. And so I guess there's a question that I have coming off of that, guys, is that in your experience, and Emily, you can feel free to chime in on this too, how many people do you think actually understand the LODs as a percentage in what we do and where we work? Because we still have these conversations about what does 350 actually mean all the time.
I don't think the percentage, you know, just based on my experience and my industry experience was probably a few years back when this was a little bit newer, and it was something that we were continually pushing. We had internal presentations, education series to get people to understand it, but you know, the people that really needed to be in the room were too busy and not there to necessarily understand what we were really doing. So I think it's an uphill battle, and just that education piece. But I think now, you know, people are talking about it more. There's, you know, we're having this conversation right now. So that means it is important. We have people on the call who, you know, are asking questions, getting engaged. So we have these thought leaders who are pushing this forward, and we just have to keep moving. But it's you know, the couple things that I've really picked up on everyone's feedback so far is education. You know, getting people and the right people educated on what we're doing and planning early. And the key is to get this conversation started at the very beginning. And that is how you're going to be successful. But, you know, we're hearing more about it, and it's definitely something that the conversations are happening.
There's some great resources out there too, Emily. I know AIA's got some good stuff. BIM Forum, that website has some great visuals on kind of what that LOD means for each individual element. That can be a really powerful teaching tool. I know when I was at the engineering firm previously, that's the document, you know, whatever the current year was. I think they're up to 2019 now, but whatever document they had out, that's what I use basically as my teaching tool. Because a lot of times it's just easier to get a visual, and LOD 200 means different things, you know, for different elements of the model. You know, that has a way different dynamic to it in a structural model than it might in an electrical model. So it's those types of things. I think it's, again, I know we keep harping on the education, but you have to kind of push those materials and just be doggedly persistent in putting that information in front of the people that are going to be putting those contracts together and making those types of decisions.
definitely. I think something that could help further the LOD, and I haven't looked at it in a while, but understanding the data that is needed. So, from a contracting point of view, for just creating construction documents, having a door marked, having, that simple information that requires the construction documents, having that in the LOD, and it might be in there now, I haven't looked at it in a while, but that one thing, we're all visual, so being to see it very visual, but as we move forward in this whole data-centric world, understanding what data is required for a construction document, set of documents that's using a BIM is somewhat important. I think that would help the industry move forward a little bit better in understanding what that means from a data-centric point of view. I don't know. That's just my thought of how can we get there a little bit better. And it might be in there now. I haven't looked at the 2020 BIM forum where they're at. They come out with, I think, every 2 years or something like that.
Yep. I think it's really
So
just taking
that's
the
an
time to
interesting
dig
point.
into it. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Bruce, because that data part of it is going to be another conversation our industry needs to have. I know on industrial projects specifically, contractors are asking for parameters to be put into these model elements to help with that facility management at the end. And they're asking it simply because they're not the author of those model elements, right? There's the contractors coordinating the model, but they're not necessarily creating the models. Well, the designers and the engineers are a little apprehensive in putting that type of facility type information in there. So it's going to be a whole nother set of dynamics. I see some of the things you're talking about as far as door information and that coming into the BIM forum spec now, but that's going to be another whole arena of where does that data, just part of the construction documents, and where does that data actually tell you what's being installed, and does that make it a means and methods?
Yeah.
So we'll have to start understanding what that's going to mean from a contract standpoint. And again, having those conversations at the beginning of the project so that we don't have these conversations at the end when it's not that it's too late, but now it's going to cost time and money,
It
right?
costs more.
Yeah.
Mhm. So how does COBE requirements play into LOD? This was talked a little. Mark mentioned COBE earlier. Les has a question. I've not seen this implemented as much as I would have thought, since this info is already in the model. So is there a correlation? Do they work together, LOD and COBE?
My experience is that it really doesn't work really well together.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, mostly because the COBE becomes a static piece of document. The COBE is just a translation piece of software, and it's an Excel file is the format. And so every time you export it out, this information, it's now static. It's not a tool to push or pull data. So you can say that the data within the COBE is at some sort of LOD, but again, it's a manual process of going in and looking at that information at those milestones and whenever you export that data out. I have not seen any really good correlation between the two. It's more of a judgment call on the team that's putting it together.
Okay. All right. So has anyone used the model development specification MDS that James Bedrick developed? And if so, what size of project does this pertain to?
I have not, but I'm aware of it. There's lots of different, I guess, standards that are trying to be developed by Building Smart, by the National BIM Standard. These definitions for how we speak to each other, to communicate to each other. It really comes down to like what Sam was talking about, is the data, and how do we as an industry say one element is this for nationally, locally, internationally? What is that? And there's so many different entities coming up with stuff. It's hard to standardize on one. The US is actually not very good at having some sort of mandate to help us guide us in a direction. We're broken up by states, by counties, by local cities, their codes. So it's very difficult for us to work together in that format. And I think, again, that's communication with our teams. So it falls back onto us and how we work together with these models, with this data. Unfortunately, I've been looking at a lot of the international stuff, the ISO that came out finally, I think it's the 19650, which is the next evolution of the PAS 1192, which is all UK type stuff, but it's actually more than just the UK. It's Australia. There's a bunch of other countries that use this mandate, and it really is a good tool to help the rest of the world kind of understand where to go with BIM. It's very well thought out how it works, but it's not something that's here mandate that we have to follow in the United States yet.
Do you think we're heading in that direction, or will that ever happen? I mean, I feel like we've been talking about this for years now, and I don't even think we don't have a standard that applies to everyone. And now, if we're talking about a standard for the design and construction side and standards for facilities, it's just kind of shocking that we're not there yet. And looking at other countries that have been doing this for a while now.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I think it allows us to focus on who we're working with and create relationships with the teams. And I think a big part of it is we come up with something like AU, what you guys are doing now with this kind of conversation. It just comes back to an education of how do we work together. Our world's getting smaller and smaller, so the more we can work, I'm working from home, you're all working from home. The more we are going down this path, I think the more we'll have to have some sort of understanding of and it comes down to the data. I mean, it's the next information is the next piece. It's here, it's now. It needs to be pushed faster and communicating better. So it will get there. I will be retired because it's been 20 years and I've been saying the same thing for the past 20 years. So the young people, and I love to see the young people. I think there's some great young people out there who have taken on the mantle of BIM and really pushed it. The Dynamo and scripting and having conversations where the design firms are actually developing and implementing their own software to get this stuff done is very promising. So yeah, it'll get there at some point. Just I'll be retired.
And there's nothing wrong with that at all. There's one question in the chat as we just kind of wrap up. We're getting at the top of the hour here. Where does element rendering materials fall into the LOD spectrum, if at all? Clients commonly confuse LOD and photorealistic presentation graphics.
Yeah, that's a big one. I don't know, Sam, do you have something? You came from the design side.
Well, again, first of all, it depends on the project team. I mean, you have some people that want to convey information as clearly as possible. So it's going to depend a little bit on that project team and the capabilities of that team. Ideally, you'd like those things tied together so that whatever you're showing the client is actually the material that's there. I mean, that's just a communication 101. I don't want to be showing a material that I think kind of looks like it and find out that it looks nothing like it. But as we both know from the design side, spending the time and the effort to make those connections in the design phase of things, there's not always compensation for that. So you have to kind of weigh how much of that information needs to be there. And I guess I've experienced a lot of times where the owner's perception of what they were going to get might have far exceeded what they actually got, you know, based on what was originally set up in the contract. Well, that's a communication thing and an education thing, and you can't always educate people to a concept, but I think we have to do a better job of putting that information out there. You know, we get a little tunnel vision. We're in this every day, right? We hear these terms every day. We hear all these things, and it's our language, right? Well, it sounds like a foreign language to most of the clients that we end up dealing with. So if we don't take the time to take a step back and talk about what each of those things means, you're going to get situations where you don't meet those owners' expectations then. So that's not necessarily a failure of that owner or that owner expecting more than they're paying you for. I think it's more of you got to communicate what that means, you know, at the very beginning of things. And if they want to see something more, I've had really good experiences, you know, when you explain that to an owner and say, hey, we can do that, right? We can take that to the next level. It's just going to cost us, it's going to be more time on our part, and it's going to cost more fee for us to get there. If that owner really wants to see that, typically that's not an issue then to get compensated for that. Where it becomes an issue is if you are just expected to do that and you do it and you don't talk about that from a contract standpoint, and then you try and charge them extra after the fact. Mm-hmm. So again, right, just have those communications at the very beginning and try and, as best you can, visualize what those expectations are going to be and document those expectations so that as much as possible, everybody's on the same page from the start of the project.
Yeah, and it's things that we've always done in some form or respect. You know, if it's an interiors would always lay out a board of all the different samples that they are going to be getting. And if it was a contractor, they do mock-ups, right? So it was always kind of there. We're just now moving it into a digital realm. And I think it's a good point, whoever asked that question, that should be part of the contract documents in that AIA E23 and those protocols. If that's something that is coming down the pipe and you can see that instead of saying a mock-up, which used to be in our specs or it's still in our specs, or a sample board, we change it to be a virtual, you know, this is what we're going to do. And it'll be a virtual mock-up or a virtual board or something. It's just a change in language and comes back down to that communication. So it's just the technology is changing it. Is it going to be in a VR? Cool, let's put some goggles on you and you'll be in your space. And you can actually show it and you can actually open up doors or whatever. You know, those are different ways of saying the same thing that we've always said. And understanding, if we communicate with that owner that, you know what, you're going to be putting on some goggles and you might get sick, or if there's some ground meat, you know, I don't know, it's just something that it kind of just changes the conversation, but it's still the same standard of care that we've always had.
So before we wrap up, does anyone have any final last comments? I really appreciate Bruce, Sam, Don, and also Mark. A lot of great resources, valuable experience. You know, we're going to be doing more of these. We've got a lot of really great feedback that, you know, having industry experts as well as, you know, our local resident experts here at ATG, just to share and give people the opportunity to ask questions. I know it's a little challenging because you don't know what people are going to ask, but I think with the group, we're always able to handle anything that's thrown at us and to really just share. And I think that's the key here. As industry leaders, we need to be sharing what we're doing, what we're learning to help others out there. There were some people in the chat that are fairly new to this. So gaining that experience from us and, you know, taking the charge and moving, you know, our industry as a whole, all disciplines forward with this. So any final comments, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
I would just say as you try and tackle LOD as a topic at your firm, just have a consistent approach. You know, have your resources aligned. Whoever your insurance provider is, I'm sure they have input on this. You know, like if you have Willis from an architecture standpoint or whoever it may be, they've got information on this, right? Make sure that you align their information with your resources and your contracts and your process. those things all need to kind of line up. So keep it simple to start with, but just try and make those things all be consistent so that it becomes something that your company and your group just understands that this is the way we're going to do things. If you jump all over the board, it makes it really hard to get a product out there that's going to have the same results every time.
Definitely. You know, most of us have worked with some sort of BIM execution plan or BIM management plan, and rarely do we apply that at a contractual level. And there's so many good resources out there to help firms with the contract. I think that's the scary part for most of them. Is just, okay, I'm comfortable with what I've always done. It's worked well. And then moving into something new. And I think Sam, you're right, is talking to your legal and your insurance groups to make sure that you are on the same page. And it works within your company. We're always having that conversation with our group, and you know, we're small enough where everyone has a say in it. But on large teams, you know, sometimes that's a little bit more difficult. But you know, the larger you get, usually you have more resources to play the game. And so it is a balancing act. And you know, I've been doing this for 10, 15 years now, talking about BIM, and it's rare do we actually have it as a contract. Very rare, hardly ever. And I think it's important that we kind of step into that now, especially because this is an LOD for owners and contracts. We need to have that conversation now with our owners. How do they participate? How do we participate with them whenever we start talking about this LOD? And it's not just visual, it's also data. You know, be aware of those things.
Excellent.
I just want to thank Bruce and Sam for taking some time out of their day to join us, and everybody else in attendance. Guys, thanks so much for coming to the conversation. Like Emily said, this is where it starts. And I think that's been kind of the theme that's been echoed here is that we need to have these conversations, and we need to have them across multiple disciplines, across contractors, engineers. It doesn't really matter. We all need to play nice in the same sandbox now, guys, because the tools are kind of forcing us to do so.
I appreciate ATG for inviting me. This is awesome. Known you guys for so long, so it's great to always be part of your team. So great, thank you.
All
Yeah,
right.
I'll echo Bruce's comments there. I really appreciate the invite. This is great. I'm glad you guys are doing these.
Excellent. And if there's anyone out there on the call right now that has future ideas for these town hall events and would like to volunteer to be on a panel, shoot, I've had a couple. I've had a couple people, or I voluntold them that they're going to be next. And but no, it's your experience and your knowledge that really makes this work. So I appreciate it, and so does ATG. So. All right, I'll see everyone at the next town hall.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right on.